All right, today we start Ecclesiastes 10, and it's 10 plus. We'll get into 11. I thought there were only 11 chapters, and then Daniel reminded me there's a 12th chapter. So we got just enough, and we'll finish just before Christmas. Do you know what a one-trick pony is? Linda Ronstadt had an album, One Trick Pony, but it's just, a one-trick pony is a dog, a person that can only do one thing. They do it very, very well, sometimes better than everybody else, but once they've done it, I will often read a book that is exceptionally appropriate for the moment, wisdom that I needed. And then that individual, that author, will write a second or a third book because the publishing house said, oh, you did so well in your first book. And that person tries, and no matter how hard they try, the second, third, fourth books are never as good. It's where when you see this, and you have somebody who sings a song, who writes a movie, and it's beautiful, it's wonderful. And then they go to make the sequel, and the sequel is never quite as good as the original. When we start talking about this for Solomon, what we are looking at is he's trying to say, I am outside of all of this. He says, I used to be inside. And so it's Solomon, I really believe that Solomon is writing about his former self, about the guy who ate and drank, the guy who had 300 wives and 600 concubines, who had a stable with so many horses that he couldn't count them all, who went through all this. And he says, I am going to use myself as the teacher to teach you things. Verse 1, dead flies make a perfumer's oil ferment and stink, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. We're back into some of the proverb type moments. This is why, by the way, that most of us and ancient Jewish tradition never doubts that Solomon wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. That's why I said there's a little difference between us and what the Bible Project says. Because this is just Solomonic. Now, this passage is for those who are administrators, as well as those who get in the way of their work. Too often, great people have their work undone by someone who doesn't care about anything except themselves. And so when we begin to see this section, he's saying, there's this beautiful perfume, and you love its smell. But if you fill the perfume full of dead flies, it changes the smell. Remember the last chapter, and the person who did a great thing only to have everyone forget. Solomon is saying, you can't fix the world, so do what you can and commend your work to God. He's giving us, as the teacher says, there's all of this going on in the world. There's always a fly in the ointment, but God sees, even when nobody else does. God is able to separate the smell of the perfume from the smell of the dead flies. And so even if nobody else can smell, God can. And so he says, just remember this. Verse 2, a wise man's heart goes on to the right, but a fool's to the left. Now, by the way, Solomon had no idea about left and right in politics. That's not what this is about. This is about right being the mind and the left being emotions. And he's actually saying that no matter who you are, you have a tendency to either be controlled by your mind and rationalism and thought processes, or you're run by feelings. And so he says, well, the wise, they tend to go toward more wisdom. But even that, when you read the Hebrew, there's this little clause in there that says that neither one is 100% right. But he says, if you only go about feelings, he says, you're just going to keep going down a road that dead ends. So when we start looking at all of this that Solomon is putting out there for us, either through himself at the beginning and the end, or the middle where he's talking about, like I said, I believe his self that experienced all this and discovered the folly of it, the hevel of it, he says, remember that you are who you are. In verse 3, he says, even when the fool walks along the road, his heart lacks sense, and he shows everyone he's a fool. One of my favorite movies growing up was the Poseidon Adventure. You may or may not have seen it, but it's about this ocean liner. It's New Year's Eve, and everybody's celebrating, and the ship is sailing, and there's this giant wave, and it turns the ship upside down. And so everything is upside down. And the little boy, by the way, who had visited Shaft Alley, knows the way out of the ship, and he says, we can't go out by swimming up. He says, the only way out that might be possible is for us to make our way to the bottom of the boat, which is now the top of the boat, and Shaft Alley is the thinnest place, and if they show up, that's where they would be able to cut through the hull and rescue us. And so there's a fireman, and there's all these people that go with him, but everybody else says, no, we're going to stay right here, and they climb up the Christmas tree, which is now pointed downwards, and in order to get to the next level, and just as they get out, of course, the windows burst, and everybody that stayed in the ballroom drowns. And along the way, people either do brave things or stupid things, and so there's only a few that wind up getting rescued. Solomon is saying that when the fool is out there, they can initially look like they know what they're saying or doing. They can look like they're smart. They can say things so people think they're smart. But eventually, as they're going down the path, they get caught. You can tell a fool 100 times about something, but he will not accept it. And eventually his foolishness is shown for what it is. A fool can only get away for so long about doing the things that are foolish before eventually they catch up. Psalm 38, for my sins have flooded over my head. They are a burden too heavy for me to bear. My wounds are foul and festering because of my foolishness. Now just think about that for a second. My sins have flooded over my head. Literally, I am drowning in my sins. My wounds are festering because of my foolishness. David understood that what was happening to him was the direct result of his sin. 1 Corinthians 2:14. The unbeliever does not welcome what comes from God's Spirit because it is foolishness to him. He is not able to understand it since it is evaluated spiritually. David was able to make the connection between his sin and what was happening. And later he cries out, God, please save me. But here, Paul says, the fool won't listen because he says the only way to understand what is happening is a spiritual matter from the soul. Now, you've heard me say this before. Most people just say there's a body and a soul. I believe there's a body, a soul, and a spirit. And there's not a lot of us, but I got this from one of my professors, and when I read Psalm 139, Psalm 51, Genesis, it makes so much sense that God created us all with a body and all of us with a soul. But the soul is what is empty because of sin. When the Spirit comes into the soul, it completes us. And it allows us to understand and see things because we have a built-in translator. Paul later on says, who can understand the mind of God except the Spirit of God? And he says, because the Spirit is in such a place, knowing God's mind, body, everything, and soul, that he can explain it to us. So if I only have a body and a soul, and I'm missing the Spirit, it's like having a phone that has all this capability, but not having a battery, or maybe not having internet access, or, in other words, I have the capability, but because it's missing an important, integral part, I'm not able to access. And therefore, I only see everything as foolishness. Then we go to the next one. But we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. I mean, when I talk to people, they find out I'm a pastor once in a while, very rarely, but once in a while somebody will say, you can't believe you believe that Christian fable, that made-up story about God. You seem like a smart person. How could you possibly accept that? And you back up and you look at it and you say, okay. And you always want to apply logic. You want to point to the Bible. My favorite is when a believer points to the Bible, hands the Bible to a non-believer and says, if you read this, you'll understand. No, they won't. They've already decided that everything in that book doesn't matter. So reading them the scriptures, no matter how hard you try, isn't going to make a difference until the Spirit allows them to see. This is the whole story of Saul, who becomes Paul. He's blinded. He comes to faith. And the scales are removed from his eyes, and he's able to see not just the world around him, but he's able to see the truth of God. And so if we're going to be fools, then we must be fools for the right thing. We're foolish according to the world, but not according to God. Verse 4, if the ruler's anger rises against you, don't leave your place, for calmness puts great offenses to rest. Patience. I love this. Psalm 25:15. A ruler can be persuaded through patience, and a gentle tongue can break a bone. Now, in just a couple verses, we're going to get to one of my favorite verses in all of Scripture, and I love to use it because it is so true. Our natural reaction when things are not going well. So we were talking about our septic and sewer update, and we've got a guy in the church who's been going through a lot of stuff with the Department of Permitting and Planning. And if you weren't here at Thanksgiving, we are no longer in the pre-permit stage. We are now in the queue, which means sometime within the next day to 18 months, we will have an answer, either yes or no. And everybody goes, oh. And I go, no. We're at least in the queue. Technically, within 18 months, we will have an answer. Yes, that's a long time, considering we've already waited 18 months, but at least we're in the queue. Now, here comes the fun part. When we see that, it's so easy for us to say, well, all of this should have been able to have been done earlier. Yes, it should have been. But in this, as much as I would love to go down to the Department of Permitting and Planning every day and be like that widow that keeps bothering the judge, we've learned that we need to just back up. We need to allow the process to take place. Because if we make somebody angry, we definitely will have to wait 18 months. So instead, we have an individual who every week will follow up. We're paying his company to follow up every week just to see if there's any questions. And the way they ask is, hi, I'm calling about permit number blah, 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 blah. Just wanted to make sure there were no questions that needed to be answered. No more information that you need. Oh, you haven't got to it yet. Thank you very much. And every week, we're actually paying his company so that every week he checks on the status of the permit. And he will do it politely and nicely and always as though we're trying to help them rather than them help us. So from Proverbs 25, we go on to Romans 8. Now in this hope we were saved, yet hope that is seen is not hope, because who hopes for what he already sees or has? But if we hope for what we do not see, we eagerly wait for it with patience. But this hope that we're talking about with Jesus is a hope that is guaranteed. We know it's actually there. It's ours. There is a place in heaven with our name on the door. There's no doubt about it. Even though we can't see it, we know it's there because God always keeps his promises. And so our hope, by the way, is more than just crossing our fingers and, grabbing a lucky rabbit's foot and one of those things. We know that God has these things. And so it's just a matter of patience. My granddaughter is going to turn, she's got a birthday coming up in January, and they've promised to take her to Disneyland for her birthday now that they live in Southern California. And so they had to make a chain, one of those paper chains, and every day you remove it because it's very hard to explain to someone that in a little over a month you're going to Disneyland. They have no concept of time. So they made the chain, and of course it's really, really long, and every day she gets to remove one paper link. And eventually, of course, it'll get down to the last 3 or 4, and she'll want to, because now, unfortunately, we're also teaching her remove a link. She won't necessarily connect that to a 24-hour day. So she'll get it down to 3 or 4 and just go, whoop, okay, let's go. But they've already said, when you get to the end, it's there. In other words, we've already paid for it, we made our reservations, they're going. This is my favorite verse in the Bible, Proverbs 25:22. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat, and if he's thirsty, give him water to drink, for you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. When you are nice to somebody who is angry, when you are polite and giving to someone who's out of control, in the back of their mind, no matter what they're thinking and reacting, they have to deal with the fact that you're being nice and polite. And so when they're screaming and yelling and you say, wow, this must be really important to you. I'm so sorry. It sounds like you are really experiencing a tremendous amount of pain and anguish in your life. Is there anything I can do to help you? This is that burning coals on their head because it is something that they have to deal with, that you are not responding the way that they expect you, because they are antagonizing you, expecting you to respond and so that you guys wind up in a screaming, pulling hair match. And God says no. Insofar as it has to deal with you, be at peace with everyone. Verses 5 and 6, there is an evil I have seen under the sun, an error proceeding from the presence of the ruler. The fool is appointed to great heights, but the rich remain in lowly positions. Now, the first thing you got to understand is we shouldn't be surprised when somebody gets elected or appointed who cannot do the job. This is the way the world works. You're usually appointed to a job because you did a favor for somebody. You get elected because either you have a great smile or you had enough money to buy ice cream for everybody, or, in other words, your reason for getting elected is rarely because you are the best qualified for the job. Nancy and I were watching a show that she loved, and I came to love it as well, Ted Lasso. And somebody finally asked one of the characters, I'm sorry, who are you? And she says, I'm famous for almost being famous. And the first thing that told me was, this is the whole reality show thing. And every time, by the way, that the news announces, so-and-so did this, or so-and-so did this, or this person died, and when I'm around my daughters, I get to say, who are these? Oh, Dad, they were a really popular YouTuber. They were an influencer. They've got a reality show. Because I don't pay attention to any of those things. And so I said, so they're famous for almost being famous. And my daughters have learned to say, yes, Dad, in your world. Got it. Verse 7, I've seen slaves on horses, but princes walking on the ground like slaves. Now, here slaves are not meaning slaves. They're slaves are individuals who should be under the rule of someone else. In other words, they actually should be working for someone else, but somehow they got elected or appointed, or they found themselves in a position far above what they deserve and can handle. The princes are those who should be able to rule because they have the capability and the ability. And so he says, this is what I've seen in the world. He says, I walk into a place, and you've probably seen this. You walk into a store, and you go to the person, it says manager, and you ask a question, and they're like, hold on. And the manager is 45, 50 years old. And they bring over this 18-year-old kid, and they ask him a question, and the 18-year-old knows the answer and can take care of it in 2 seconds, whether it's technology or just whatever. And this is what he's saying. He says, now this person might be the manager, and they might have the age and the wisdom or the credit rating, whatever it was that allowed them this position, but the truth is, it's this 18-year-old kid that makes minimum wage that actually allows the work to get done. Verse 8, the one who digs a pit may fall into it, and the one who breaks through a wall may be bitten by a snake. Now, this is simply saying, we got all these proverbs. He says, even when you know something is there, okay? I often will do something. I'm working on a project or at church or at home or whatever, and in my mind, I go, don't forget that cord, that box, whatever, so you don't trip over it, and 2 seconds later, I trip over it. So even though I know it's there, even though I reminded myself it's there, even though I said don't trip on it, I still trip over it. So this is actually, by the way, a proverb that was told among grave diggers that said that they would be out there digging the graves, and they would be busy talking to someone, and they'd take a step back. So a long time ago when I was working construction, I was up on a roof, and I wasn't paying attention. By the way, this is before cell phones and earbuds and all that stuff. But I was rolling out the tar that goes down on the roof. And I'm rolling it, and literally, I swear I was Wile E. Coyote for about 1 second because I got to the end of the roof, and I swear I hung there for 1 second before I dropped into the bushes down on the ground. Unfortunately, it was only one story, and I was in a lot better shape, so I didn't get hurt. But my dad is up there, and he goes, was that fun? when I crawled back up the ladder, and I said, not nearly as fun as I thought it would be, but I was so busy rolling the tar out that I didn't realize. And he goes, if you turn around, you get to see where you're going. I said, thanks, Dad, for the wisdom. You could have told me that like 10 minutes ago. And then he says, by the way, sometimes you don't know what's there. Walked into the bathroom, my office, started to close the door, and there was a centipede hanging on the pin for the hinge. And when I closed the door, a couple of his legs got caught in it, and he couldn't go forward, backward, he couldn't do anything. So it was really easy for me to go get a pair of tongs and get rid of him. But it's one of those things that, think about this. There are times in your life when you're doing something and you have no idea what the consequences will be because you can't see past the point where your hand is going into the wall or the door you're closing, or maybe you go downstairs in the dark because you're trying to not wake anybody up. Verse 9, the one who quarries stones may be hurt by them. The one who splits trees may be endangered by them. Now, this is one of those things that really shouldn't be considered wisdom because it should be common sense. And yet, what does every commercial that is talking about medical treatments or some sort of pharmaceutical, what does everyone end with? Well, no, but also tell your doctor if, right? Yes, and then you'll die. But the thing is, it's one of those where once upon a time, my doctor told me about myself. Now, I have to tell the doctor, now, doc, don't forget, I'm allergic to, and I had this, and this happened, and, And so common sense is no longer as common as it used to be. So how is it that someone who does something all day long and for years and years can get hurt? And the answer is because we become complacent. Whether it's rolling tar paper across a roof and not paying attention when you get to the end, or whether you're tired, or whether it's the end of the day. But sometimes Solomon says that we can actually get to the point where even though we know better and we are greatly skilled at whatever it is, sometimes. There's a guy named Adam, and he does these YouTube shorts where all he does is he finds all these absolutely crazy construction accidents and things that happen to people, and then he pretends that he's watching them, and then he reacts to them. And they're fun to watch as long as nobody gets seriously hurt. But oftentimes, there's the guy who's sawing the tree, and it falls on the house. Or there's the guy who has decided that he's going to hook a chain or a rope up and pull something, and instead it rips the rear of his truck off. Now, like I said, you look at this and you go, how is it possible that they didn't realize that was going to happen? And then we think about all the times in our life where we did something thinking we had it all planned out and we got surprised. Verse 10, if the axe is dull and one does not sharpen its edge, then one must exert more strength. However, the advantage of wisdom is that it brings success. So work harder, not smarter. Isn't that the way it works, or is it the other way around? Should we work smarter, not harder? Now, here's a question, though. Why doesn't the world value experience as much as they used to? See, once upon a time, if you walked into a place and you said, I have a lot of experience, I've done this, you were almost guaranteed to be hired. Today, instead of experience, we want people who have a entrepreneurial or a creative mindset, because we're always looking for a way to do what we're doing faster and cheaper. It's not about better anymore. We just want it faster and cheaper because with all the costs associated, we want fewer employees because then we get to shave money off, and we want it done quickly so we can have better turnover. And so we look at this and we ask the question, how is it possible that we can work through this? And the answer is, it only works, by the way, as long as we have either fresh customers who aren't going to, who are just going to come once or twice, or we have people that are very forgiving, or we're the only ones in town that do this. And this is one of the struggles that we're going to struggle with. Once upon a time, by the way, when there was one Lutheran church in town and one Presbyterian church in town and one Catholic church in town, you never thought, if you were born Lutheran or born Catholic or born Presbyterian, you never thought about changing churches. The only way you might change churches would be to marry somebody from one of the other churches. And then the two of you had to deal with both of your families who said, I can't believe you're dating a Presbyterian, or I can't believe you're dating a Lutheran. And somehow then you would find your way, and then you would have to decide whether you were both going to become Lutheran, both become Presbyterians, both go to different churches, or quite likely, by the way, you would move out of town and choose a church that was completely different. Because this was so rigid. Today, about 50% of our Savior might have some connection to the Lutheran Church. The other 50% either never did, or they're here because of someone who encouraged them. And when they leave, it's not like they're going to go find another Lutheran church. And so when we talk to people, we have to ask them the right questions. What are you looking for? Because if they're just looking for a Lutheran church, well, you found it. But they may walk in and have asking something completely different. They may be saying, I'm looking for a place where I can. And this changes the way that we see it. This is why, by the way, because my wife went to a place recently that totally messed up her order. She had these beautiful cookbooks made in memory of her mom, and all the recipes and pictures of the kids and stuff. And she chose this one picture that was supposed to be the cover, and it was just going to be this great thing. And the books arrive, and she's got, an architectural firm on the cover? And it says whatever it is, RER Enterprises. So she calls them up, and she says, and the guy looks at it, and the guy goes, that's not the picture you chose. And she's like, duh. But even though they messed up, they fixed it like that, responded quickly. They're shipping 4 more copies. And, in other words, they fixed it. Meanwhile, we have 2 other companies that we dealt with that won't even answer emails, won't accept phone calls. And the Home Depot actually had somebody come out and do an analysis and says it is totally their fault and they're not going to fix it. So we're never, ever going to go back to them and never recommend anybody use them again. And this, what? Home Depot is partially responsible because, they're like, well, it really wasn't our problem. Well, you hired him. Well, yeah, but that doesn't count. But this is where you look at this and, but then somebody comes along and says, well, why should you have something against us? Because you won't fix this. Well, again, why should you have something against us? In other words, you should just let it go like everybody else did. And this is where Solomon is saying we start looking at the things of the world, and if we step back and get a bigger perspective, and we don't trip over the stair, which can cause us to then lose it, or we don't get too close where we're now too close to see the truth, he says we begin to see things from a perspective that allows us to understand better. Verse 11, if the snake bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage for the charmer. So, if you've ever seen that, and it's interesting that Solomon brings this up, they put the cobras in the baskets, and they lift it off, and the guy plays the flute, and the snake just dances, and it's fine. So the problem is, if you take the lid off and don't have your flute unpacked yet, and it takes a while to get around to it, you get bit. Well, that kind of defeats the whole thing about charming the snake. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. But even then, even if you do everything to train your child up, there is still no guarantee that they're going to do what they've been taught. And so he says, we understand we'll do everything we can to charm the snake, charm the child, charm the employee, charm the boss, whatever, but there's still no guarantee. Verse 12, the words from the mouth of a wise man are gracious, but the lips of a fool consume him. Does it make a difference when you speak the truth in love? It should. How often does someone respond differently when you don't attack, but rather show empathy? But also sometimes, if you attack, it rarely makes things better, unless in a show of force they realize you have the upper hand. But usually if that's the case, that's the best way to just say, if you ever watched MASH, every time someone would challenge Colonel Potter, he would say, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Speak to the eagle on my shoulder. Okay? Verse 13, the beginning of the words of his mouth is folly, but the end of his speaking is evil madness. Again, somebody can always make what they're saying sound okay. Now comes the question. Because once in a while, somebody will say, I got this great idea. And everybody goes, oh, that sounds fun. Can they pull it off? That's the real question. And by the way, most of the time, when somebody announces they're about to build this or do this, it has actually nothing to do with them even being close to that. What they're actually saying is, what I'm doing is I'm announcing this, and I'm hoping a bunch of people are going to come flooding in and give me money to do it. Because you'll notice the number of times here in Hawaii. By the way, how many of you love the gigantic world-class aquarium out at Ko'olina? That was announced 20 years ago and never got built. Why? Because they announced it. The light rail. You know, they've been talking about it, and now it's gotten to the point where we're up to 11 billion, and we're still going, and because now it's more expensive to get rid of it or stop it than it would be to finish it. And how many want to place bets on when the new stadium, if it ever gets built, will be ready? Because they still claim it's going to be ready for 2028. Oh, we haven't awarded the contracts, we haven't torn the old one down, but don't worry, it's going to be ready. Okay? In other words, I can do such a thing that everyone says, man, that is so great. And then, but when you follow down the strands and you get there and you say, well, that's not even possible. Foolishness tends to devolve instead of evolve. Matthew 6:7, when you pray, don't babble like the idolaters, since they imagine they're going to be heard for their many words. And this is why Solomon continues with, yet the fool multiplies words, yet no one knows what will happen, and who can tell anyone what will happen after him? So, how many of you ever wrote essay tests in high school or college? And the question was, what year did King Charlemagne do this? And you filled 4 pages. Why? Because you couldn't remember the year, but you thought if you put enough stuff down, the teacher would at least give you partial credit, right? Or they say, you know, what did blah, 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 blah? And you just keep writing, hoping that you put somewhere in there. The teacher would look at it and go, yeah, okay, there's the answer. Granted, it's 274 words down, but I found the answer. Because you couldn't remember which was the proper answer. Even the wise struggle to communicate with few words. There is a powerful lesson in asking questions first, just before adding just more words in hopes of saying something worthwhile. And this is a lesson that I struggle with, but it's a lesson that when you learn it, this is the gift of communication for some people. When you ask a question, and the other person, instead of just going on and on and on, hoping they eventually answer your question, they return and say, now, by that, did you mean this? No? What did you mean? Ah, I see what you mean. Okay? I went to a thing 30 years ago with Jake about, we went to a thing and Disney came out and gave us a little taste of their customer service and stuff. And one of the things they teach their employees is when I walk up and say, what time is the 3 o'clock parade? Now, that just sounds stupid, right? 3 o'clock. No. What do I want to know, Ginger? I want to know when the 3 o'clock parade is going to get to this point. Because I know it starts way over there. So when do I need to be at this point to see the parade go by? And so they learned that. They also recognize that people will carry a piece of trash for 15 feet, but no further. So they have trash cans every 15 feet. Now, all of this stuff that they learned. And they learned it by watching. They actually paid people to watch. You know, somebody's got this thing in their hand. They're like, they can't find a trash can. You know, and they'll walk like, okay, and then they just drop it. Or they say, you know, what time's the 3 o'clock parade? Well, it's at 3 o'clock. Why do you ask? Well, I just want to know when it's here. Ah, that's a different question. You know, people are always asking me, do you know what time it is? Yes. Were you going to tell me? Well, you didn't ask that. Okay, well, it is about 10:21. So it's about answering the question asked. And this is what he's saying. He says, the wise, instead of just blurting out words, will find out what you really want to know and do their best to answer it. Verse 15, the struggles of fools weary them, for they don't know how to go to the city. Now that just sounds strange, right? They're fools because they can't find the city. To me, You know how I find the city? I look for the bright, glowy thing, right? I mean, when you're out driving on the mainland especially, and you're out on one of the interstates, and you go, hey, we must be getting close at night. Why? Because I can see this glow. And the closer you get, the more glowing it is. Well, Psalm 107, some wandered in the desolate wilderness, finding no way to a city where they could live. So remember, Solomon is remembering some of the things that dear old dad used to say. The city is where you find what you need. The city is where there are places that take care of you. There's hospitals, there's stores, there's everything you can imagine. And so when you can't find the city, it means you're found wandering for 40 years in the wilderness, having to make do with very little. Verse 16, woe to you, land, when your king is a youth and your princes feast in the morning. When your leader is too busy eating to govern the land or out riding horses or playing games, the nation falls apart. Anybody remember what Marie Antoinette said? Let them eat what? Cake, which I didn't understand. I thought, well, I'm really thankful. I would have liked her as my queen. But that was because they had no bread, and she was just being sarcastic. And so when your king or your prince or whoever it is that's governing your land is so busy taking care of themselves that they're never governing, the nation begins to fall apart. So Psalm 119, how can a young man keep his way pure? By keeping your word. Again, this is something that Solomon remembers dear old dad saying. If I'm young and I have been given a position of authority, how can I govern properly? First of all, listen to the wisdom of God. Secondly, actually do my work. Verse 17, blessed are you, land, when your king is a son of nobles and your princes feast at the proper time for strength and not for drunkenness. Most of us know when we're fortunate to have a leader, the leader we have. During normal times, anybody can govern. It's on cruise control, and by the way, cruise control means that you are slowly going downhill, and you don't, it's going so slowly that you don't recognize how far you've gone. And by the way, if you go downhill, chances are you're going to have to go back uphill, which is why you need the best leader that you can possibly have during times like COVID, during national crises, wars. This is where once in a while we discover a person like Winston Churchill, who had no ability to govern during peacetime, but very few were better during wartime. Pearl Harbor, when Pearl Harbor happened, what we discovered was a tremendous number of our military leaders were trained to just hold down the fort rather than go out and do what needed to be done. We find that sometimes we become complacent. And so Solomon says we need to understand the difference between a leader who can lead and another one that can just hold down the fort. Verse 18, because of laziness, the roof caves in, and because of negligent hands, the house leaks. I've got a dear friend who has been a contractor for 60 years, and he is absolutely amazing at the work that he can do. But what do you think his house is like? The screens are torn, the windows don't close right, and every time you say, hey, and he'll always say, I'm going to get to that. And in all these years, he never has. But you go to the houses he built, and they are perfect. Verse 19, a feast is prepared for laughter, and wine makes life happy, and money is the answer for everything. Now this is the teacher, sarcasm. When someone is running away from something, they prefer distraction to actually facing the challenge. Okay? Verse 20, do not curse the king even in your thoughts, and do not curse a rich person even in your bedroom, for a bird of the sky may carry the message, and a winged creature may report the matter. The curse of email and social media where someone says something in private or doesn't realize or doesn't care that others are reading it. Matthew 18 says if we have a problem, we go to that person individually first, try to solve it. Then we bring a couple in to help arbitrate between us. Then if necessary, we take it to the congregation. Then if beyond that, we excommunicate them, meaning we treat them as one who needs the message of the gospel. We don't kick them out for the sake of kicking them out. We push them out saying, we want you back, but we need to resolve this. And this is what Solomon is saying. He's saying, we need to understand who we are and the purpose of what we are. And so if we are going to say something, we need to make sure that it is something that we would say to that person's face. Our purpose is not to tear things apart or create problems, it's to solve them. All right, chapter 11. We're going to get just one verse into there, 2 verses into this. I love this. Send your bread on the surface of the waters, for after many days you may find it. Give a portion to 7 or even to 8, for you don't know what disaster may happen on earth. Now, if you were reading this, if all you had was this, imagine you looking at this and going, this is like those old Bob Dylan songs from the 60s and 70s and some of the other things. You have no idea what these people are talking about. This is another parable. It actually translates as cast your bread on the waters. In other words, be generous when you can. That way, when you need something, someone will be able to take care of you. It's the parable of the shrewd manager. The guy goes, hey, you're fired, but before I fire you, settle all the accounts. And the guy goes around and he grabs everybody and he says, look, I know you owe me $1 million. I'll settle for 100,000. Great, done deal. And in the purpose, the manager realizes that he's making all these deals, but the owner actually says, what you did was you thought you were creating friends so that they would hire you when you're done. But actually, this is the job you should have been doing all the time. Because obviously, if the guy owed him $1 million and he could have got $1 million, he would have. But he recognized that the guy was in over his head. And so he says, but I'm doing this because that way, when this guy fires me, I'll go and say, hey, I'm the guy that knocked $900,000 off your bill. Will you hire me? And of course, oh yeah, because you're such a great guy. What Solomon is saying is when we make friends, when we do unto others, it means when we have a struggle. He says the day will come and by God's grace we'll be taken care of. But if we shove everybody off, when we have a need, why would anybody come to our rescue? All right, we're going to hold off there and we'll jump in, finishing off chapter 10 chapter 11 in 2 weeks, and then we'll finish everything off on the 22nd.